Hi everyone, I'm Libby, and I'm out here in this beautiful area of Jonathan Dickinson State Park to share an amazing story with you about a tiny little bird. Now, this tiny bird may have a huge impact on other wildlife and the landscape that it lives in. Now, not only is it tiny in size, but it also has a unique sound, kind of like a squeaky toy or a little rubber duck. Now, until recently, this bird had not been seen in this area of the park or the surrounding area for about 70 years. Logging activity had taken place until about 1950 when this area became Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And that logging activity removed a lot of the pine trees that are essential habitat for brown-headed nuthatches, particularly for their foraging and nesting behavior. So you may be wondering, why are we out here today and why do we want to share this amazing story with you? Well, out here with me is Rob Russmaneth, a park biologist, and he's going to help answer some of these questions. So Rob, there's a lot of wildlife in this park and a lot of landscape to take care of. So what got you thinking about brown-headed nuthatches to begin with?
So 10 years ago, me and another park staff member were looking for these nuthatches and other breeding birds in the pine flatwoods that you see around us today. And we couldn't hear or find that squeaky toy bird flying through the woods. So we kind of further investigated. We talked to various researchers that were in the park at the time and looking at different publications, and we found that this area north of West Palm Beach, from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Okeechobee, was virtually empty of these nuthatches, brown-headed nuthatches. And through our research, we found a person, an expert, Jim Cox at Tall Timbers Research Station in North Florida. And we started conversations with him, and he essentially volunteered his services to bring birds from another state park 70 miles north of us, St. Sebastian River Preserve State Park. He volunteered to bring those birds from there to here. They have lots and lots of them up there. And over the past 2 years, we've brought birds to Jonathan Dickinson State Park.
That's a lot of thought, effort, and care that went into these tiny little spooky birds, and it's great that you were able to connect with an expert like Jim to make that happen. Now, you mentioned that he introduced them about 2 years ago, so how are they doing now?
So initially, we translocated 10 birds in the latter part of 2018. Then brought, a year later, in 2019, 10 more birds. And what we've seen is that most of these birds are sticking around. So that's a huge success in any translocation. And then, on top of that, we found 5 nests at least. A 6th, maybe, we're not sure. We've noted that we've had 6 fledglings. So 6 birds that have been born on site. First birds that have been born on this property is probably the 50s or earlier.
Wow, that's definitely an awesome success story. How do you see them in, say, 5 or 15 years?
Sure. So we have some different goals. In 5 years, we're hoping that those 4 breeding bird groups that we have will be somewhere around a dozen, maybe more, but that's our goal for 5 years. In 15 years, those dozen birds, the dozen breeding groups will look more like 2 or 3 dozen breeding groups. And then beyond that, like I mentioned before, is that we're part of a larger landscape. We're about 10,000 acres, but in this area there's 150,000 acres of publicly owned land, and maybe 50,000 of those acres can be occupied by the nuthatches. So hopefully in that 15, 20, 25-year time period, looking out, those birds will spread to those adjacent properties.
That's a lot of land for these little little birds to cover, and I can imagine that a lot of it is pine flatwoods, which is a fire-dependent ecosystem. So does fire play a role in their success?
Yeah, so like you pointed out before, we're in pine flatwoods right now, and you might be able to tell that this area was burned about 2 weeks ago. And so the nuthatches live in a fire-dependent ecosystem. And typically, those fires occur in the transition or the wet season, the transition season from the dry to the wet, when we get thunderstorms starting. And those thunderstorms obviously have lightning. Lightnings occasionally starts fires. And after those fires, all the vegetation you see around us comes back. That vegetation, that fresh new growth, provides forage for insects that the nuthatches feed on. So in that way, it's a boost for nuthatches. There's another way as well that fires maintain the pine flatwoods for nuthatches, and that is lightning or wildfires will occasionally kill trees, kind of like we see in our background, and that is where the nuthatches make their nests.
From what we've talked about, or what you've mentioned, you can definitely tell that fire is essential for these tiny little squeaky birds. And you also mentioned their cavities. Would other animals use those cavities?
Sure. A variety of other animals will use those cavities. So a couple of examples would be another bird, an eastern bluebird, doesn't make its own cavity, so it could use a nuthatch cavity. A totally different example, mammal, would be a flying squirrel. So that's an animal that's out at night, a mammal, and it again doesn't make its own cavities. They're definitely out here. And then a variety of insects will use the cavity for shelter as well.
Hey, so you might even call them like ecosystem engineers in a way, kind of like gopher tortoises. You can tell that they're really connected to the landscape and other wildlife, and they have a positive impact on other wildlife and the landscape that we're in. So Rob, with everything that we've talked about today, what would be the main message that you would want to share?
The main message that I want folks to take from the reintroduction of nuthatches to the park is one of love for the park. Park staff live and breathe this property. It's also our job, but we want this property to be the best it can possibly be. And when you come into the park, we want you to discover that flying squeaky toy that you didn't see 5 years or 10 years ago.